Yeah.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. If we haven't met, my name is Katie Richter. I am the Public Programs Coordinator here at the museum, and I also organize this lecture series. I have to thank a few folks here because we can't be here without support, so we have to give thanks where thanks is due. The Minnesota State Arts Board, the FM Area Foundation, the Arts Partnership, we're thankful for all their support, as well as our members Annett, Richter, and John and Carol Sue Andreasen, who have donated to support this lecture series. And of course, all of you who continue to attend our events, who support with donations and your membership, we're so grateful for all of you. So to introduce the woman you come to hear tonight, Nicole Derenne is a teaching associate professor at the Department of Art and Design at the University of North Dakota. Derenne teaches art history, including introductory visual and fine arts appreciation and art history survey courses. She also teaches advanced art history courses such as feminist art history, contemporary art, and art of specific genres and historical periods. Derenne received a Master's of Art in Art History degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a Master of Public Administration degree from the University of North Dakota. She will receive a Doctor of Education in Educational Practice and Leadership from the University of North Dakota in May 2025. Tonight, Nicole will be discussing connoisseurship. Together, we're going to examine the influence of connoisseurship on the discipline of art history and the identification of great art. Finally, we're going to take on the roles of connoisseurs ourselves by considering 12 artworks and joining in conversation with our lecturer. So will you please help me give a kind Rourke welcome to Nicole Derenne?
Should know. And as Katie mentioned, my name is Nicole Derenne, and I am a teaching associate professor at the University of North Dakota. I'm trying to get the screen to work here. Thank you so much. I've been teaching at the University of North Dakota for 22 years now, and I'm teaching art history, and during that time I also served as the director of the local arts council and of the Public Arts Commission. And I had started teaching full-time at UND in art history in 2016 and have been loving every moment of it. I teach undergraduate and graduate students, and last year, I taught a class on contemporary art, as Katie had mentioned, and one of the things that we talked about was connoisseurship. And I wanted to share with you tonight the role of connoisseurship in art history. And so when I was thinking about what to talk about today, I thought, what if we talked about artworks that everyone should know? But this assumes that there is one definition of art, that there is one way of thinking about what great art is. But actually, art has many definitions, and that definition has changed significantly over time. And so my discussion today will focus on the role of connoisseurship in determining what is great art. And so we'll talk about what connoisseurship is, and then we'll talk about how art has been defined over time. And that is what I'll use as a guide for determining the 12 artworks everyone should know. So before I get started, I wanted to see a show of hands. How many of you here have a background in art? Maybe as a practicing artist, art history, comes to 18th century art criticism. Art criticism really emerged in the 18th century with the development of newspapers and widespread printing as a way to highlight what people should look for when they go to the annual salons and what art should be considered great. And so people, sometimes trusted the art critics, sometimes didn't trust the art critics. But the connoisseurship, the tradition of connoisseurship started when art critics started to think, a lot of this response to artwork is kind of hot air. Let's make this more of a structured activity. Make it more something that, it has some sort of rationale behind it. So what happened was art critics started to develop a language that highlighted a sense of style. And so you've probably all heard style before, right? So how artists create work based on unique patterns, perhaps ways of producing art or following a movement. Where does all that come from, right? Where do we identify art historical styles? It comes from this tradition of connoisseurship. And really thinking about how art is identified and artists are identified as following a particular style. So throughout history, style was not as important as beauty. And so there's been lots of philosophizing about beauty and the role of beauty in art. In the 19th century, with the development of connoisseurship, the focus switched from beauty to artistic style. And so the development of written materials by art historians like monographs or maybe articles, journal articles, or magazine articles about artistic styles or movements, or perhaps artist biographies where art historians would study a particular artist, become an expert in that artist's work, or perhaps the development of exhibition catalogs or catalogs that covered the entirety of an artist's work, were ways that art historians and art critics shared their ideas about style. And so when we think about what is great art, one of the things that I think is important to consider is who is telling us that, right? Who is determining what great art is, and who define what art is? And it comes from this tradition of connoisseurship. And so one of the things about the training of art historians and art critics in the 19th and especially in the 20th century, and even today, is that the student or the art historian has to travel to see the work in person. So you have to be really attentive to the details. Seeing the work on a screen is entirely different from seeing the work in person. Would you all agree with that? Yes, right? So different. And so this then leads to a this concept that a person, when they are identifying a style of an artist, focuses on the marginal details of an artwork. So for example, a person could look at an artwork and know immediately that is by that artist, this is representative of this style and of this time period. This is how I was trained in art history. And I totally follow this. And any of you do this too? Kind of just identify an artwork and just say, I know what that is, right? And it comes from this tradition of connoisseurship and identifying artistic styles. So one of the critiques of connoisseurship is that it leads to elitism. Because first you have to have resources to see these works in person. They may be spread all over the country, all over the world, essentially. And also, when art historians and art critics are espousing the work of the artists that they spent their career studying, and then saying, this is great art, they've studied this artist, how could they not say it's great art, right? So there's this sense of elitism in terms of who is saying what is great art and what is not great art. So what I'm going to do today is, really explore this idea of connoisseurship. So you may be wondering, who is a connoisseur? So a connoisseur is typically a person who has some formal training in art history, or some knowledge of cultural representations. And so a connoisseur might be, for example, an art historian, or perhaps an art critic. Anyone here read the art critics and maybe like the New York Times or New Yorker or right? And so, or any sort of popular publication like that. What those critics are doing is saying, you know, like, this is what the artist's message is, and this is why you should go see this work, and this is why this work is important, and this is what it means within the scope of art history, perhaps, or the contemporary art scene, or what have you. And so that person, the person writing the article, would be, for example, a connoisseur. So there are some challenges to connoisseurship today. So contemporary, that is today's training for art historians goes beyond connoisseurship. So in order to really understand contemporary art, you have to know more than just the ability to look at a work and identify the style. You have to understand the theory behind art. So that would include, for example, starting back in ancient Greece, right, with the theories about beauty and ideal beauty, looking at the ideas of the Renaissance and the development of a story or a narrative in art as instructive, or perhaps theories about formalism, that artwork can portray emotion and evoke emotion from a viewer just based on what it looks like. That is, the lines, the colors, the shapes are enough to carry meaning in an artwork. And going into contemporary theory, more critical theories. So for example, like materialism, or looking at the social, economic content of the works and how it reflects various maybe economic or social milieus, or perhaps a post-colonial perspective, or a feminist perspective, or existentialist, or post-structuralist, or postmodern. You have to understand the theories of these that underlie this contemporary work. I'm not going to get into the theory today. That would be pretty deep, but we'll touch on it a little bit. So what I'm going to do today is first ask you, are you a connoisseur? So how many of you here, just a show of hands, would say you're a connoisseur? Okay, great, wonderful, great, wonderful. Okay, great. So today I am going to play the role of a connoisseur. I am going to tell you what you should look for in art. And I'm going to identify 12 artworks that I think everyone should know. And at the end of my presentation, I will invite you to share what it is and how would you identify artworks as artwork that everybody should know. So when I was developing this list of 12 artworks, I thought, oh, I haven't named any 12 artworks, right? What are the 12 artworks that resonate most with me? And I thought, you know, if I'm going to talk about connoisseurship, I think it would be more fun and appropriate to talk about how the definition of art has changed over time, and how being a connoisseur, you have to be aware of how art reflects these changing ideas about art. So what I'm going to do is identify 12 artworks that represent historical ways of understanding what art is. So this is a perennial question, right? So what is art? There's so many ways to identify that. Today, oftentimes we see art as a personal expression. Anyone here create art as personal expression? Yeah, right? Absolutely. And that is a very modern way of looking at art. For most of history, art has not been a personal expression. It has been an expression of a patron, either a wealthy individual or perhaps organization like a church or a monarchy or state or what have you. And the way that we see art today, again, is very different from how people have seen it in the past. So I'll start by talking about how art approximates ideal beauty and take a look at ancient perspectives on art and the concept of ideal beauty espoused by Plato, for example. Take a look at how art represents virtue ideas of virtue, especially through the Christian lens of light, and how light represents a spiritual experience, and how art is a spiritual experience. Take a look at how art is instructive. It provides a story. This is a very Renaissance era approach to art. So 15th, 16th century European approach to art. Take a look at 17th century Baroque ideas about art. How art shouldn't just tell a story. It should engage the viewer. It should delight the viewer. It should, really, move the viewer into an emotional state. We'll take a look at an 18th century Kantian perspective on art. That is that art is a universal experience. That is this idea of aesthetics. Aesthetics means feeling, essentially. So if you ever had surgery and you had anesthetic, that means not feeling. Right? You're not feeling anything. So aesthetics means that you're feeling something. You get that feeling, such as from looking at an artwork. And so this idea that art is timeless and provides a universal experience means that everyone has the ability to access this emotional experience when viewing artwork. And everybody has the same kind of experience. This is one of the roots of the development of aesthetics, essentially, in a philosophical tradition. There's a historicist tradition in the 18th and 19th centuries that art is something that changes over time. You can trace that development. What happened before something impacts what happens after it, and so on and so on and so on. And art has a definite end. So if you've heard of the philosophies, like by Arthur Danto, for example, the end of art, or heard about this idea that art is ending, that comes from that historicist tradition. So then we'll take a look at the 19th century ideas of art being something that doesn't have to reflect life. It's something that can be understood on its own terms. It doesn't have to tell a story. It doesn't have to portray a naturalistic representation. It can be something that can be stylized, or even moving toward abstraction. And then we'll take a look at how art has layers of meaning. This is where we'll start to see a transition to more critical perspectives in art history. And where we start to see it doesn't necessarily mean it has a universal experience, but rather that there's many different experiences that a viewer might have. Starting to recognize that when a viewer sees a work of art and reacts to a work of art, it is their interpretation that creates meaning. And this is a very postmodern or contemporary way of seeing art, very different from that universal experience that I mentioned earlier. We'll take a look at how art has a social purpose. And this is a more materialist view of art, meaning that art has the understanding art can't just look at what it looks like or consider what it looks like. You have to think about the economic, social, cultural context in which it was made. And art promotes critical perspectives. And this is a broad umbrella. And so artists might, for example, instead of thinking about aesthetics, or perhaps about what the art looks like, or different layers of art, thinking about how the external world basically influences what an artist does, and how an artist might approach work. So for example, artwork that critiques or provides a post-colonial perspective on experience, or perhaps an existentialist perspective on experience, or psychological or surrealist expression. Art promotes postmodern perspectives. This is another more contemporary view of art and art history, and this means that artists recognize that their authority as an artist isn't necessarily where the art ends. So an artist might create a work of art, like the work that you see around us here, right? But you as a viewer bring your own experiences, your own stories, your own interpretations to that work. And so when an artist shows a work, it basically becomes, the meaning becomes ownership come into question. And artists explore concepts like appropriation. And we'll take a look at that with this example. And art promotes feminist perspectives. And so this is one particular critical perspective that highlights inequities in the arts. So for much of history, female artists were really and sometimes not recognized or perhaps not given resources to produce art. And so in 1971, Linda Nochlin, the very famous art historian, wrote one of the most influential articles in art history, which is why have there been no great women artists? And asking essentially, look at all these great modern artists, Picasso, Matisse, Kandinsky, Duchamp, etc. We have other women. And she concludes that it's not because women aren't great, it's because they don't have access to the educational and social structures that would allow them to have the training and access to galleries and museums and other types of exhibition spaces that would allow them to produce art. And so this was a turning point in art history, and really was one of the major ways that we pushed toward our postmodern growth. So I'm going to provide examples of each of these, and invite you at the end to tell me what I missed. Because this is just my view, right, of what is great art. So first thing, art approximates ideal beauty. Did you refer us? Anyone familiar with that? Yes, okay, great. We should take a seat in art history maybe. Art history classes, yes. This is the key. What this means is that this is the ideal classical beauty. This is not the original. The original does not survive. It was originally cast in bronze by Polyplatus. We know this because he wrote a treatise called the Canon. And he wrote a document that described what ideal beauty is. Ideal beauty is perfectly balanced, is perfectly proportioned, uses a concept called symmetria, essentially, where there is kind of an equal distribution of movement in a work. And then he created this work, a Roman copy. Romans loved this work and made lots of copies of it. And so we have a marble copy, but the bronze copy doesn't survive. There's a great story that accompanies this work, and that is that Polyplatus, famous sculptor in ancient Greece, had asked the public, and said, what do you think a sculpture should look like? What would it be a beautiful sculpture? And so that was feedback, and he made that sculpture, and then he made his canon. And so he showed both of these works, and people saw the sculpture that they informed, and they're like, oh, that is horrible. No, this is just, no. They saw the canon, they said, that is beautiful. So the Doryphorus means spear bearer. In ancient Greek culture, the male body was venerated. The male body was the ideal. Spear bearer could refer to an athlete, could refer to a warrior. The word, you guys are familiar with gyms, right? Gymnasium. That means naked, essentially, because ancient Greeks performed athletic events in the nude. And it was very different from how we see athletic events today. People would basically engage in athletic events until someone gave up, passed out, or died. And so here, this is like the ideal body, ideally proportioned. Every part of the body is in perfect proportion. Take the little pinky finger, for example, proportion that to the hand, to the arm, to the torso, to the legs, perfect proportions. Uses symmetria with one bent arm on one side, a bent leg on the other, weight-bearing leg in contrapposto, and slightly turned to the side. Again, this is not a real person. This is the ideal. So Plato had written about this. This became the standard of beauty for centuries to come. Now, jumping ahead, art represents virtue. So virtue has lots of different interpretations. Aristotle talked about virtue ethics, what it means to have good character. In the medieval world, virtue focused on a Christian interpretation. That is living a virtuous life, following the teachings of Christ, for example, and then also highlighting was through something called lux nova, means new light. And that was through stained glass windows in the Gothic period. And I chose this work as one of these works that everyone should know, Chartres Cathedral. This is the Church of the Virgin Mary in Chartres, France. And I wanted to show this work because it's a great example of how architecture has changed over time. So you'll notice that this architecture right here has a little bit different tower than right here, right? And that is because this building had a really interesting history. It was built, burned down, built, burned down, built, burned down, and it was built then in what was known as the Romanesque period. And it had a relic inside of it that people would visit, and as part of what's called a pilgrimage, where people would go from place to place to place along these early roads and across Europe to save their soul. And the relic that was here was the mantle of the Virgin Mary. It was a very sacred relic. It burned down, the church burned down, but they were able to save the relic. And so they rebuilt the church, but instead of building it in the Romanesque style, we built it in the Gothic style. So this is Romanesque right here, kind of more plain. Here, Gothic, all these spires and lots of like openness within the structure, including flying buttresses, like we see over here, which opens up the walls and makes the walls really thin. They're not weight bearing. The flying buttresses are weight bearing. And so it opens up the walls to allow stained glass windows like this, that idea of lux nova, new light, a sense of virtue. So when someone walks into this structure, they are entering into a holy space. It's a transformative space. It's different from the phenomenal world outside. So art instructs through narrative. How many of you are familiar with this word? Still valid, right? This is standard throughout history classes. Yep. This is painted by the Renaissance painter Raphael. Raphael was considered the ideal painter, master painter. And so here, Pope Julius II was the Pope who commissioned this. This is in the papal libraries. And Pope Julius II was known as the warrior pope. He wanted to expand the holdings of the papal states and the power of the papal states. And he hated his predecessors. So he didn't want to live in the same quarter. So he had a new residence built, a new library. He had to hire someone to paint the library and to paint here images on the library walls. So he hired the best painter around, Raphael. And there's 4 walls. They work with the different themes. This is the School of Athens. And it follows this Renaissance idea of what art is. That is, it's something that tells a story, something that instructs. Here, the story that's being told is, you've got 2 figures in the middle here. You've got Plato right here saying, look at the abstract, this abstract beauty, for example. You've got Aristotle right here saying, no, not the abstract. Look at the real world, real experiences, right? 2 very different ways of understanding the world. And then all around are images of ancient figures, different philosophers or mathematicians or what have you. There's a story that's being told here. You'll notice that we have 1-point perspective. That is that the building, and follow these lines down, comes down and meets right here. So this is a way of organizing space pictorially. This is not how we see the world. We don't see the world in 1-point perspective. We have 2 lines. So, but it's a way of organizing space, a way of saying this is a pictorial narrative, this is the story that's happening. And then here we have some more contemporary figures. Michelangelo right here in the foreground, Bramante right here, who is a famous architect at the time, and Raphael's peeking his head up right over there. So put himself in that painting, that's one of the greats. So here, the idea here is that art is something that has a story. It instructs. Now, in the 17th century Baroque period, one of the most famous artworks of the time is Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes. And the story here is that Judith was a widow in an Israeli community. And they were under attack by Assyrians who were a group from the ancient Near East. And Judith had gone into the Assyrian camp and caught the eye of Holofernes and had essentially seduced him, got him drunk, took him back to his tent and beheaded him. And then took his head back to her father. Her father put it on the gate to their community. When Holofernes' soldiers saw what happened, they fled, and she saved her people. So this is a pretty dramatic story, right? And this is a pretty dramatic painting. This is really different from the School of Athens, because at this time, 17th century Baroque period art was meant to not just tell a story, but to move the viewer, delight the viewer, create a sense of awe in the viewer. Now, this is a really interesting story as well, because Andreasen was a female artist, of course. Her mother died at a young age, and instead of remarrying, her father, who was a well-known painter, brought her into his studio, and she then trained as an artist. Well, he was out one day, getting as an artist would do at the time, and she was left under the supervision of a chaperone. And chaperone left, and one of the other students under her father's tutelage raped her. And so the father learned about this, was so upset because the soldier refused to marry her. And so he took his other student to trial, whereupon Andreasen was tortured to see if she was actually telling the truth, with thumbs through and so this story here is maybe, could be telling her own experience. That is telling the story of a powerful female figure. And this is the beginning where we see artists putting their own stories, own background in their art. So it's not her story. She wasn't Judith, of course, but she's maybe channeling the story. Now, this subject was not a new subject at the time. This is a work by Caravaggio, a very famous artist, a contemporary of Andreasen. And you can notice the difference in how Judith is portrayed in these works. Judith seems kind of tentative here, a young girl, where here she's a strong woman. Here's her maidservant Elba, and they have agency. The reason why this story was so popular was because this was a time of the Counter-Reformation in Italy, meaning it was a response to the Protestant Reformation. And the story of Judith was a non-canonical text, meaning it wasn't in the traditional Bible, but it was a way to showcase how they basically fought for their people, was victorious, and a way to say, fight for your church against Protestantism. Very popular subject matter. Now, one other note here, the reason why I chose this work is because Andreasen and her father left Rome after the trial, and then settled in Florence, and then moved off to England, for example, where she had a phenomenal career, but she was lost to history. And it wasn't until the early 20th century when scholars started to recognize her work and realized that a lot of her work was misattributed to artists like Caravaggio and other male artists. And so her work, essentially, even though she had a really lucrative career, was again lost. And it was due to the scholars of the 20th century who started to think maybe there are other stories that are being told. So another way of looking at art is that art is timeless and provokes a universal experience. Anyone familiar with this work? Yes, okay, this is iconic, right? Mondrian's work. This is a work by an artist named Piet Mondrian, who was associated with the Dutch movement in the early 20th century called the stijl, or the style. And the idea behind artwork like this, or non-objective art. So just so you're aware of what I'm talking about when I say non-objective, if that's not familiar. So there's a continuum of representation. So there's full of the eye kind of representation, right? Like these photographs, they're highly naturalistic. Or then you've got more naturalistic representation, then you've got stylization, which it looks kind kind of naturalistic or kind of breaks the figures or objects down to shapes. And then you got abstraction, which kind of breaks a composition down to shapes, lines, colors, but still has some anchor in the physical world. Then you have works like this that are non-objective, have no relationship to the natural world. So here, Mondrian was considering something that was really popular at the time, and that is an idea of utopia. So what would art look like in a utopian society, right? Would you even need representation? Would you need storytelling? Would you need artwork that could, engage the viewer? So here, what he's saying is that art stands on its own. The lines, the colors, the shapes present in this work create an emotional response from the viewer. You don't need to have a story. You don't need to have representation in a natural world. So this is a tradition that stems from abstraction. So some of you may be familiar with this work, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Picasso's great work from 1907, that he didn't show publicly until the 1930s. And what he did was he brought people into his studio who saw his work. And so one of the people who brought into his studio was George Rourke, who painted this work in collaboration with Picasso. And together they developed Cubism. Now, you might think, what is that? Right? This is the figure of a portrait, basically. It's called a Portuguese. And so this person sitting with his hands on his lap, we've got the top hat, and once you kind of understand Cubist language, you can start to understand and pick up where the figure begins and the background ends. Or the figure, you can see the difference between the figure and the background, basically. But it takes a trained eye, right? And but there's still some anchor in the physical world, in the phenomenal world. Not here. This is a universal experience, essentially. This is following the Kantian idea that art is for everybody, and everyone has access to feeling this way. I also wanted to show you some works that relate to the historicist view of art history. That is, that art follows a trajectory of stylistic development. Again, this is that connoisseur language, right? Artists have different styles, and what happened before affects what happens after, etc. I wanted to show you 3 Davids. So the first is Donatello's David. This is perhaps the most famous David. Maybe not so famous, but the most important David, because it's the first freestanding bronze sculpture since antiquity. And so in the Renaissance, early Renaissance here, in the 15th century, Donatello was one of the leading artists and metal worker who said, I like these bronze statues. They fell out of favor in the medieval period because they were too close to paganism, too close to the Greek and Roman sculptures, the large-scale bronze freestanding statuary. So a lot of those were melted down. Only 30 or so bronze original sculptures from Greece remain. And so were melted down for utilitarian purposes, weaponry, perhaps, other objects. And so Donatello was like, this is the Renaissance, means rebirth of classical culture. And I didn't like those statues. I'm going to make a full-size statue of David. And so this is David from the story of David and Goliath in the Old Testament. And it's just after he defeated Goliath. And you can see here, he's got a sword, and he's got Goliath's head right there. He's got a laurel wreath on his helmet, showing that he was victorious. Now, Michelangelo also made a David. And this David is very different. This is an adult, larger than full-size David, 18 feet tall. It was meant to be on the top of the dome of the Florence Cathedral, which is why his hands and feet are so large compared to the rest of his body. Because it was meant to be seen from far away. But when the Florentines saw this was commissioned by the Florentine government at the time, which was a republic, they said, that's amazing. We're not going to put this in a place where people can really see it. We're going to put this in the plaza, in Florence. And it was a symbol of Florentine resilience. So the Italian Peninsula and the Italian Renaissance was a hot mess, I'll just say. It was just not a great place to be. There was all this fighting between the different governing bodies. And the Medici was holding onto power, and there were duchies there were other republics, and there were kingdoms, for example. They're all fighting for resources. And Florence was very desirable to a lot of other governing bodies around it because it had a lot of artwork, it had a lot of resources, and it was always under attack. But somehow, it always managed to pull through. And so here we have a statue of David just before he encounters Goliath. He's got his slingshot with the stone over his shoulder, and you can see him looking kind of apprehensively off to his side, following that same sense of ideal beauty, contrapposto, for example, the counterbalance, so one weight-bearing leg, one not weight-bearing leg, that we saw in the Doryphorus, that first slide. And then you've got Bernini's David. It's about 100 years later, during the Baroque period. Now, he's in the moment of action where he had fired off the slingshot. And this, again, was made during that period where art was meant to move the viewer, engage the viewer, delight the viewer, not as a figure to be looked at, but to interact with. And so Bernini is one of the great architects and sculptors of the Baroque period in Italy. And he's creating this sculpture to demonstrate again the resilience, essentially, and the power of the story of David and Goliath. And you'll notice here we have this progression, right? 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, and this idea that one artwork informs what happens next, and what happens next, and so on. And so this is a great example of that historicist view of art and art history. Art does not reflect life. It can be understood on its own terms. This is one of the most influential works in the history of art. And it's influential because it represents what happens when cultures intersect. So this is The Great Wave by Husaki. And this is a print, it's part of a series, and it is a woodblock print. And it was created by Husaki in the 19th century, early 19th century, as part of what was called the Ukiyo-e, style of woodblock printmaking. What this means essentially is that it's a style that developed in Japan, when Japan was isolated itself for about 200 years. In 1853, the West, namely America, basically said, you need to open up your doors to the West because Japan is a strategic location between America and China. We really need to have this as a connecting point. And so under the threat of invasion, they opened up their doors to trade. And what happened was a lot of commerce emerged, and some of the objects that were imported from Japan, which was praised for Japanese culture in the 19th century, were wrapped in paper that had prints like this on it. And so people had access to these types of prints, or prints that were more kind of focused on prints. So that is printed on fine paper and then treated as an art form, essentially. And so one of the reasons why this work is so important is because it showed artists what could be. Art didn't have to be naturalistic. It didn't have to be something that told a direct story. It could really engage the viewer in an emotional way. It could be stylized. And some of the kind of aspects that we see here that are so influential in artwork to come are things like this. The outline, using the contour line, using broad areas of color, using a unique perspective, showing everyday life, or showing moments, essentially, of maybe an elite culture, which was part of that ukiyo-e tradition. And so prints like this really caused artists to see artwork in a totally different way. That is, the artwork doesn't have to reflect life. It is something that can stand on its own. Here's another one that highlights ways of seeing art that emerged more commonly in the early 20th century. Artwork has layers of meaning. Anyone familiar with this work? The fountain, yeah, very good, of course. This is
It's a urinal.
It's a urinal, right? What? Why are we looking at a urinal, right? This is a work by Marcel Duchamp, and the reason why this work was considered one of the most important works of the 20th century is because it said art doesn't have to mean one thing. Art can be many things, and it's what you say is art that makes it art. So what happens is Duchamp is a Cubist painter in France. He's kind of a middling painter, and he puts one of his works in what was known as the Armory Show. And that was shown in 1913 in New York and Boston and Chicago. And in the Armory Show, it was called an Armory Show, it was held in an armory in New York. This was the first time that American artists were exposed to the modern art that was happening in Europe. And I gotta say, some people loved it. People loved Duchamp's Cubist works, but a lot of people hated it. In fact, these students at the University of Chicago were an effigy of modern Matisse, one of the modern artists. They hated the work so much, it was so challenging. And so then Duchamp, his work is known in America. He immigrates to America, and his reputation preceded him. He became this big name artist in New York, and he was part of a juried exhibition, which I'm sure you know is basically an exhibition where artists submit their works, and then you have someone select those works for to bring a show. And he's like, I'm going to put this work in, and he signed it under a pseudonym, Armut. And so he submits it, and the people who received it were like, yeah, I don't think so. This is a urinal? What on earth? Well, Duchamp comes in, and he's like, where's that work? Armut, I need to see this work. And so they go back in their storage area, and they're like, hey, this, urinal. And because Duchamp is saying, this is such a great work, you can put this in the exhibition, in the exhibition. And Duchamp is just like, you have a urinal in your exhibition, and the only reason you think it's art is because I told you that it's art. And so he raised the question, what is art? How do we know what is art? Do we rely on the connoisseurs? Do we rely on the people who are knowledgeable about art, or do we make our own decisions about what is art? And so this work sparked a whole different way of seeing art. This is part of a movement. Duchamp was one of the leaders of American Dada, which is a movement that emerged in the early 20th century that means the irrational or nonsense. In fact, the artists got the name from Dada by just opening up the dictionary and just picking eyes closed. Dada means rocking horse. So the idea behind Dada emerged in the First World War is that the world is chaos. The world doesn't make sense. Why should art make sense? Why should art follow any rules? And so Duchamp is coming at to artwork from this perspective. So another way of looking at art is that art has a social purpose. That art reflects the social, economic, cultural milieu in which it was made. And I have two works here because I wanted to talk about how art informs data visualizations. How many of you look at data visualizations on newspapers, online, graphs, whatever, they're everywhere, right? This is something that started in the 19th century, a way to understand data pictorially. And the first person to really focus on data visualization is Florence Nightingale. I was talking to some nurses here before, right? So the famous nurse. And she was part of the Korean War, and after the Net War, and she noticed that there were a lot of mortality. And she wanted to understand and communicate to people who could help with public health efforts to stem some of these deaths. And she developed these lists. This is how people had died from preventable and non-preventable deaths, but it was not a way to communicate that message. It didn't mean anything to the people who she was communicating with. So she developed and worked with a lithographer to develop data visualizations. And what you see here is a visualization of deaths. These are preventable deaths. These are deaths that happened in hospitals or military theater or the battle theater that were simply not preventable. And you'll notice here a lot of these are preventable. Communicable diseases, for example. And when people saw this, the leaders saw this, they were just like, oh, okay, so we'll institute public health measures, and they saved countless lives. And so then other artists, like for example, Andreasen here in the 1920s, developed the isotype. It means the International System of Typographic Picture Education. And so what this means essentially is that he's saying, you know, they're going to communicate these ideas, this data, right? But how do you do that? And like, how do you say how many people are affected? So one figure is 10,000 people, right? And so you might see this in other data visualization that you see today, right? It starts here with Andreasen's work. And these symbols are pictographs. And pictographs mean that they're images that mean the thing that they represent. So for example, people, right? Or perhaps people in different occupations or weaponry or whatever the case might be. So symbols like this that we see today are a direct descendant of Andreasen's isotype. And so I have here the original handicap accessible sign and the proposed revision that shows handicap accessibility with a agency, essentially. So I'd like to show that as a way to understand art has a social purpose. Now, art promotes critical perspectives. Kehinde Wiley is an artist that is most famous for his presidential portrait of Barack Obama. And he also has created a number of paintings that highlight historical narratives. And what he does, I love his work, what he does is he takes a critical perspective and looking at art history in particular. So now he's not saying, we're just going to look at the artwork as maybe on its own terms. We're not going to take a look at the maybe the Dada-esque kind of approach to art, not about data visualization. This is about how artists are critiquing what's happening in culture and society. And so what he does is he takes historical paintings like Van Dyck's painting of Prince Tommaso Francesco of Savoy, Carigiano, painted in the 17th century, and he takes that composition and he puts everyday people here in that place and creates a different background. And what he does in these works is he basically says, okay, art history and the representation of art has been very Eurocentric, it has been very exclusionary, and connoisseurship and like how we understand what is great art has been really identified by art historians who, again, have this tradition of elitism, right? And so he's saying, let's look at art differently. What if we take art history and we give people who have been marginalized agency and representation and kind of turn the story of how we understand art history around. And so artists like Wiley are taking a very critical perspective in their creation of their artwork. And other artists take a more postmodern perspective. So for example, Sherry Levine is a great example of an artist who highlights or promotes postmodern perspectives. So Wiley's work is a great example of what artists might use a post-colonial perspective. Now, Levine's work really highlights how artists focus on the postmodern challenge to authority and authenticity through appropriation. This is a huge theme in postmodern art, which postmodern art means artwork from what, 1970 or 80 into today. So what Levine did was she took a photograph of Walker Evans' photograph. And this is Walker Evans' photograph, part of a series, The Burroughs Family, Hale County, Alabama. And this is part of kind of a documentary of life, 1930s and such. She took a picture of that and then framed it and said, now this is my own. I took a picture of this picture and now it's my own. I took that picture. And what do you think about that? Is that hard? Right? And so here she's following up to champion a specific point of this idea of conciergeship, right? How people understand and define art. And she's challenging this idea of authenticity, saying, encouraging the viewer to question, is that actually art, right? Is that originality? Is that authority? Is that something that represents maybe the artist's intent, or is it you, the viewer, making meaning because you appropriated that work? So this is a terrific example, one of my favorites, of postmodern perspectives. And the last thing I wanted to talk about here was art from both a feminist perspective. So feminist perspective is one particular critical perspective, like I mentioned earlier, which was incredibly influential in the history of art. Really pushed art history and art into its postmodern period. And this work, I think, really addresses so many reasons why this happened. This is The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago. Anyone familiar with this work? Anyone see this work in person? Oh man, it looks like my dream. I want to see this work. So, right? Yes, Jonathan's nodding there. And so The Dinner Party is an installation. That means it's not just one work, one thing. It takes up an entire room. So everything in that room is part of the work of art. And so this installation is a life-size table with 39 place settings. And it's set on a tile surface, and there are names of 999 other notable female figures from Western art history written on the tiles. And Judy Chicago started this work because she was following in Lynn Hampton's footprints. She was saying, where are the great women artists? And like Joan Leshy, for example, was lost to history. Many other artists were lost as well. So she engaged the work of 125 volunteers. Here's a handful of them. They're doing research on who are these artists that should be included in the dinner party. They have to do all this research to find who these artists were and what they did. And the artists were just visual artists. They were poets, musicians, writers, actresses, etc. And so she also commissioned various artists, they all volunteered actually, so to create embroidered table settings. So each table setting has embroidered names, it has ceramic place settings, and then a ceramic chalice. And so when people saw this work, like contemporary critics, Hal Foster's a great example of this, saw this work and he's like, no, that's not art. That's not art. Art is a sculpture of a lifelike figure, naturalistic figure. It is made of stone. It's made of metal. It's made of wood. This is kitsch. This is kind of like, everyday materials. This is women's subject matter. This is women's material. Textiles, ceramics, no. And others said, Judy Chicago didn't actually make this. She worked with 125 others. So this actually is not a great artist, because she worked with 125 volunteers. So, no, this is not art. And you see how people defining, how they define art shapes, how they understand what art is and what good art is. Now, others looked at this work and said, wow, this is amazing. This really highlights powerful women in Western history. And others said, wait a second, look at these plates. That looks a little bit like female genitalia, which means you're reducing the female identity to her body, right? You're essentializing the female figure and the female experience. And so feminist theorists, which were just coming into vogue at this time, late 1970s, caught on to this and were really upset about this work because of the essentializing factor in this work. And Chicago was just kind of stunned by all this. She's like, I thought people would love this work. And so it was shown in 1979 and was supposed to go on a nationwide tour. And all of the other museums got hosted and pulled out of the tour and was put into storage for 20 years. And now it is on permanent view at the Brooklyn Museum. And when it was put on permanent view, it was this big deal because this was the work that embodied the idea that art can be more than the traditional idea of, like in this case, a sculpture made of stone or what have you. It could include work by crafts that are typically in the domain of women. It can include subject matter that's outside of the norm, outside of the canon. It can tell stories that haven't been told before in ways that are challenging and in ways that engage the viewers in different ways. It can be an installation as opposed to one particular artwork. It can be a work that focuses on collaboration instead of individual genius. And so this work really sparked a lot of debate. It sparked a spirits debate over what identity is in art and essentialization in art. And Chicago's diaries, for example, are just filled with these emotional entries. I don't understand what's happening. And it's really understandable because this was a lightning rod of anger. So when we think about feminist art, this is a gateway into understanding the power of feminist art. So those are my 12 artworks, and I would invite you. What did I miss? So was there something that you wanted to see on that list? Or maybe a theme that you would choose differently? I chose historical ways of looking at art. Are there different ways you would look at art? I'd love to hear your opinion. Oh, yes.
I want to mention about the two separate issues. One is the classification of whether something is art or not, and how do you set the bar. The other is whether it's good art or not. So that one could be fairly loose about entrance into that category being art, and then it still has to be good. And you can separate the two, and if you do that, one could maybe tolerate a looser definition of art and let the evaluation stage determine what is good and what isn't.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. This is a really important point, and it calls attention to a philosophy of art that has become really popular in more contemporary times, and that is that art is what the viewer tells, it identifies it, right? So you're saying good art, right? So who identifies what good art is? Is it the connoisseur? Is it the art historian? You know, is it the art critic? And there were, there's a philosopher, Scottish philosopher Hume, who basically said, you know what, art is a personal experience, and how you define art is up to you. You define art as good, that's great. And so I asked my students, you know, do you believe in this? This is how you follow art? And almost all of them said, yes, that's how I identify art. And I love what you said too, that there's, you know, maybe this gateway, you know, into what is art or what makes art, because that has shifted over time, right? So, did I kind of respond to that?
Yeah, I'm only pointing out the two separate issues.
Oh, yes. Okay.
One is entering the class, the other is evaluating art within the class of art.
That's right, very good. Yeah, so identify what it belongs in art, right? And then how you determine if that thing that you identify is good. Right. So, yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
In my mind, these are related, maybe not outside my mind. I don't know how it would go into your categories, but I was struck that there was nothing on the list that was functional.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Japanese, Chinese ceramics, quilts, Frank Lloyd Wright furniture. There's nothing that's functional.
Absolutely.
But related to that, and I think related back here to what is art, I think there has to be something definitional that separates art from non-art, or it's a meaningless concept. If there's no dividing line, no way to do determination, it's a meaningless concept.
Thank you so much. That is a fantastic point. And it calls attention to the long-standing distinction between fine art and craft. Right? So that distinction was very clear for a long time. And it was this work right here, the Richter party, which really challenged that. fine art. And so for a long time, there was this clear distinction. Utilitarian objects, ceramic vessels, glass blown objects, maybe wooden materials like chairs, functional objects, what have you, small metal objects, jewelry. That's not fine art, right? Now that distinction has been blurred considerably in our contemporary period. And since I was looking at a historical period, it was kind of following that historical, trajectory. But I was thinking about it. I was like, what if I did 12 artworks that were on craft and showed the transitions from distinct craft to craft as a fine art, right? So that would be another theme that you could use to identify 12 artworks. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this idea of theme is because the themes that you choose in terms of identifying what is art, that is, first, what is art, like you mentioned, and then how do you achieve what good art is, depends on your overarching concept, right? So I was thinking historical ways of looking at art, but I could have chosen media, I could have chosen contemporary art that maybe is really challenging, or maybe I could have chosen feminist art, I could have chosen art that focuses on post-colonial perspective. So that was a really great comment because it highlights the value of first craft versus fine art and the importance of understanding, how you're looking at art. What kind of theme or category are you using to identify what great art is? Yes.
I can speak up also. There were things were touched on once or twice throughout your talk, but I think it would have been interesting, or I would have liked to maybe see something that discussed more succinctly or specifically groups of working artists. So we touched on Dadaism and things, but the Bauhaus, arts and crafts movement, things like that, where groups of people got together because of ideologic similarities and said, okay, we're all going to make work that is in line with these principles, and how that kind of changed the direction of how the rest of everybody else outside of these schools interacted with the work.
Fantastic. And you mentioned arts and crafts. That is a great example. So anyone have really good arts and crafts movements? Yeah, great. Okay, wonderful. So the arts and crafts movement had its origins in graphic design and in printmaking in particular. And so, and then spread to other types of artwork and other media. But we mentioned groups of artists working together. So these artists would gather together and they were very much against the modernization of art and the modern methods of creating art. And not just art, but functional objects that you might see in your home, right? They go back to a traditional way of creating art. And the printing press was one of the great meeting points for the artists in the arts and crafts movement. And so William Morris, for example, is a good example of that. And he had a printing press and basically a group of artists that worked together. And so if I had, for example, focused on the history of graphic design, it would be all about groups of artists, working together. And because that was really essential to development in graphic design history. So for example, when we look at, this is an example of graphic design, right? So we look at, for example, Florence Nightingale's data visualization. She did not make that on her own. She worked with a team of printmakers. Anyone can look at photography in the past, or it is there, right? It is really hard to do. And you need a master lithographer. And you need someone to help understand and create a visualization for that data. And so working together as a team was essential to this type of work. Same with arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau is the same way. And so these more traditional works that I've shown are kind of like following this idea, historical idea that art is made by an individual, And so even work like, for example, these works, right? The artists are given credit for these but who poured the stone, right? Who actually did the casting here? Donatello didn't cast this, right? He created the molds for it, and same with Bernini. He carved them, he poured it, who worked with him on it, did not look alone. But according to the traditions of our history, he's a great artist, right? The genius artist who gets the credit, and that is part of the idea of connoisseurship. That is, identifying who is the great artist and how we identify art. That was a great comment. Thank you.
I think this is just a theme maybe to be added, is art that disgusts or disturbs, and I'm thinking like of like romantic period, right, with the sublime or the grotesque, or Ode Mudrum's pieces, or some more contemporary artists, the things that, maybe not so much awe, it's related like in the Baroque period for the viewer, but something that's like, I'm not having necessarily a positive reaction, but I definitely feel something.
Yes, it's so good. This is one of my favorite topics in feminist art history, actually. It is called the abject, and it means the disgusting. And so this was a theme that feminist artists took up, and feminist theorists also started to explore. Like Julia Kristeva is a theorist. She explored the idea of abjection, or the disgusting. And the idea is that, artwork, use Michelangelo's work here, as the ideal beauty, right? Or perhaps the representation of females. So this is the male body of ideal beauty. In the Renaissance, there's a transition that happens where the male body is no longer considered the ideal nude. It's the female body. And this is because in the Renaissance, people are making images, usually portraits, of people who are recognizable. And to be seen in the nude would be kind of humiliating. But the female body was on view for the visual pleasure, usually of a male patron. And so Titian's Venus of Urbino, for example, is a great example of that. Anyway, so there's been so many representations of the female body, and usually in a sexualized manner or idealized manner. Where do representations of women by feminist artists, how did they create that representation? Some artists completely left the figure behind and used just text, or perhaps used non-figural types of representations in their work. Other artists said, well, there's one little category that hasn't been claimed by kind of patriarchal representation, and that is things that are really gross, things that are disgusting. And so artists like Cindy Sherman or Judy Chicago would create artwork that highlighted moments of disgust or moments of maybe despair, things that were not traditionally shown in art, as a way to say this is the female experience, or this is a way to understand women's experience. And so if you have a chance to look at Cindy Sherman's work, let's see, that's Cindy's poem. I think it was called the disaster series, I think. But it was these photographs, so photographs of a woman lying next to a pool of her own vomit. And you see the woman's face in the reflection of sunglasses. And so that's how you know that the woman is there. But it's really gross, and it's really disturbing. And what she was saying essentially was, this is the type of representation that hasn't been claimed yet. And so we're going to create images that highlight elements of women's experiences, maybe from violence or perhaps from ways that the viewer can see this and see that experience without the filter of the traditional female body or traditional female body. That was awesome.
And in this discussion, an idea for another theme to make a different presentation in the art history courses I took in college. The theme of the pendulum swinging was something that I really was interested in, and kind of focused on of like representation is something we're interested in. Never mind. Yes, we want to look natural again. No, I don't want it to look natural again. And that throughout, like, since people have been making art, we've been going back and forth between I want it to look like I see the way that I see it in the world versus I don't want it to look like that. And people arguing back and forth about that forever.
Absolutely, this is such a good point. And you see this especially in the ancient world, right? So take a look at, say, one of the things I was going to show initially was a Rourke base from Iraq, from the Sumerian culture, because it's the beginning of experimentation. And everything in that Rourke base is very stylized. It's not naturalistic at all, and that was not the point. Realistic or naturalist representation was not important. It was determining and conveying who the important figures are through hierarchy of scale, right? So smaller figures versus larger figures. The larger figures are more important. On registers, like we see the comic books, like in different, especially like narrative scenes, right? So this was something that emerged in 3000 BC, and so and then I didn't think about ancient Greece, right? With, for example, like we saw here, Polycletus is Doryphorus with this ideal body, and then you look at the medieval world, and it's totally different. Because that was not the goal. It was not the goal to portray something that was naturalistic. It was the goal to portray something that could clearly communicate the ideals of Christianity, the ideals of spirituality to the viewer. So in medieval imagery, especially from the Byzantine Empire in the East, the focus is on stylized figures that follow a convention. So when a person or patron might say, I want you to make an altarpiece for me of the Virgin Mary with the Christ child, the artist had almost no freedom in expression. It would have to be very, very medical, follow a pattern. Virgin Mary is the largest figure. If they're following other figures might be maybe smaller because the Virgin Mary is most important. Front and center, nothing between you and that figure because the relationship between you and that figure is the most important. And then maybe the Christ child would be a small man, following on the idea of the homunculus, that is, that Christ was born as a perfect person, like an adult, and didn't experience the kind of childhood that a child might experience. And so, again, naturalism was not the goal, not at all, right? That's fantastic, because following that trajectory, even into the modern world, it's really fascinating. In the 17th century, in the world period, there were a couple of artists that started these traditions of what was most important in art, right? So an artist named Nicolas Poussin, who was a French Baroque artist, said the most important thing in art is that it's structured and that the composition is clearly understood, balanced, refers to the natural world. Then you have someone like Peter Paul Rubens, who's like, no, the most important thing about art is that it's emotional and it's expressive and it has lots of color. And so then artists in subsequent centuries followed that very argument. This would be another great theme, right? So the line color debate, which emerged in the 19th century, what is the best way to create and understand art? Is it line, that structure, like Poussin? Is it color through expression? And like Rubens, for example. And so artists kind of followed this trajectory. And you even see this in the 20th century with abstraction. Here. Abstraction, like this. And then also expressionism. I don't have an example of expressionism here, but basically like really expressive, emotive work. And it comes together, lines come together, in the American movement, abstract expressionism. So I think you were talking earlier, you mentioned Jackson Pollock's work. And I didn't put his work here because I wanted to highlight, again, this idea that art can stand on its own, or it basically provokes universal emotion. But Pollock's work would be another example of that. There's a lot of Pollock in Pollock's work, which is why I didn't use it here. So, but again, that abstract expression, where we see the unification of those distinct lines. So, yeah.
question kind of piggybacks off of his, is that the fight between realistic and more expressionistic. But as you've looked at it, like what's going on realistically in the world, have you found that that's made a difference? Like if it's a very chaotic time, people usually go towards more abstract work because they don't want to represent anything, or, you know, because like, I mean, after these are what, getting World War, you know, they're going through World War I and II, and they decide, no, we're not gonna do things realistically.
Absolutely, that is such a great comment. And yes, I really do think that we see that, where we see this variation between naturalism and abstraction, and may respond to, again, the social, cultural elements of the time. So a good example of that is here with, say, medieval, right? So during the Romanesque period, it's called Romanesque, that means Roman life, because they have their architectural style, which is like one of the only art historical things after an architectural style. And so the Romanesque period was a period of great uncertainty. It was around the year 1000, and according to biblical text, the world should end in the year 1000. So there was this apocalyptic mood, and the artwork was extremely stylized and focused on the idea of the last judgment. So what will you do? What will your soul go at the end of the world? Will you go to heaven, or will you go to hell? And it was also influenced by illuminated manuscripts. That was the primary art form at the time. Illuminated manuscripts means images in books that are handwritten. Manuscript means handwritten. The artwork during the Gothic period is very different. The Gothic approach to art focuses on the sense of benevolence, this is welcoming into the church. And the work gets much more naturalistic, sculpted work. And the reason for that is because this period of apocalyptic tendency has passed, and the function of the cathedrals or the churches in communities was different. So in the Romanesque period, these were basically stopping points on the pilgrimage. So a person might go on a pilgrimage because they wanted to save their soul. They to go across these early roads and then try to get to St. James Cathedral in Spain, and then make their way back. And you'll notice that these towers, for example, are super tall, right? And that's because these churches needed to be seen above the tree line. So when people were traveling, they could see, oh, okay, that's where the church is going to head that direction. And so they stopped, church after church after church. Gothic period, it's very different. Now, the pilgrimage are still happening, but they're not as prominent. Apocalyptic mood has passed. But instead, they become centers of civic and activities, become administrative centers, in addition to worship centers, and also symbols of pride. So there's competitions. How can we build these structures higher and taller and more grandiose than others? And the artwork on these structures, artwork was freestanding in terms of sculptures, for example, still on the buildings, was much more naturalistic, almost like coming off the building. And Donatello's work here, for example, is an example of artwork that's freestanding. Saying this artwork doesn't need to be on a building; it can be on its own, just like ancient work was, just like the ancient cast bronze work from Greece was. And that's why this work was so interesting, controversial, because it was the first freestanding nude bronze. And just as a note, if I may, I've been saying the word nude, and I just wanted to highlight, because we've been talking about feminist art, the distinction between naked and nude. So I just love this distinction. So nude means that a figure is represented without clothing, but without really an awareness that they're being looked at, almost like an objectification of the body. So a nude figure, again, there's really no recognition. A naked figure is shown without clothes, but their figure is recognizing that they're being looked at. So I could have done naked and nudity as a theme, which would have been really fun, right?
make sure you grab some more coffee, tea, cookies on your way out, and we'll see you for the next one.
See you guys. You're back. If you go back to survey our history, which is my favorite part of college. I love it. I love our history survey. It was so fun. And I did a lot of the essentials. So,